a picture of me. They've got a picture of me all dressed up in your pamphlets and your agenda, but that's not the typical me. I'm normally pretty sweaty and out in the fields and dusty and working out there. So my question today is, so let me introduce myself, Shannon Pinson. I've worked with rice for 35 years with USDA, and I have a strong interest in improving the nutritional value of rice and feeding not just human hunger, but human nutritional hunger. And to cut to the end, the same topics that I would have on my wish list would be fiber, vitamins, minerals, protein, phytic acid load to reduce phytic acid and to increase antioxidants. And I'll go through each of those in more detail through my talk here. So, but I want to start with why study rice? Why is rice so important? And you can see in the picture, the map, that where rice is grown throughout the world, it's a hugely important to the world's population. About half of the world's population is dependent on rice as a staple food. And the picture to the right shows where rice is grown it gets one crop harvest a year, two crops harvest a year, and some areas get 3 harvests a year. How do I get rid of this? Is that there we go. So it's critical to food security and especially critical in several of the low-income countries throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Not only is rice important to feed the world with the energy it needs, but there is a concern that 60% of the world's type 2 diabetes is in Asia, up here where a lot of rice is consumed. So we have a concern about feeding the world with the energy it needs, but there is also a concern about type 2 diabetes being associated with rice consumption because rice is considered a high glycemic index food, a high GA food. And so that's of concern to us in rice. So one of the things I've been working with for the last 10 years is how do we reduce the glycemic index of rice? And one way to do that is to convert some of the starches in rice into what's called a resistant starch. So milled rice itself is 90% starch. If we can convert some of those starches from digested starches into starches that actually resist digestion. So resistant starch, what is that? If you eat a starch, that food goes into your stomach and it sits there for about 20 minutes. After that, that's where it gets exposed to amylases. After that, it goes into the small intestine. It spends a total about 2 hours in the stomach and small intestine. And after 2 hours, if it's not been digested at the end of this 2 hours, the food then moves into the colon. And once it moves to the colon, it's no longer being digested into glucose and absorbed as glucose. It now becomes anything that's not been digested but reaches the colon non-digested is called a resistant starch. It has resisted digestion. And it is now acting as a dietary fiber. So it's beneficial to our gut microbes at this point. So if we can, again, milled rice is about 90% starch. If we can convert some of those starches from digested starch into a resistant starch, a non-digested starch, not only do we reduce the number of starches that get converted to glucose and contribute to blood glucose levels, we also get the benefit of dietary fiber. So it's a two-sided sword, a two-sided improvement, reduced glucose and increased fiber as we move the starches from digested starches into resistant starch. To the right, we see the blood glucose levels. And most of you know, if you eat milled white rice, you're going to start digesting it. It's going to convert into glucose as you digest it, and it starts increasing the blood glucose level. In a healthy human being, the insulin will kick in right about here and start reducing the blood glucose levels again. One of the first things that a nutritionist recommends to a new diabetic, a person newly type 2 diabetic, is to convert from eating milled rice to brown rice. And you can see why here. That reduces the increase of the blood sugar levels. It spreads it out over time and doesn't take it so high. So it's a lower glycemic index food. It spikes the blood glucose less. But if we could convert rice, some of these starches, into what we call resistant starch, this is a line, the red line is from a resistant starch line that's been created in China. And you can see that the blood glucose levels never reach the recommended maximum of 8 millimoles per liter. So it stays within the desired blood glucose level. and becomes a low GI food. So the cutoff for low GI versus intermediate GI is at 55. It's barely a low GI food instead of an intermediate food, but standard milled rice is up here as a high GI food. And brown rice is an intermediate GI food. So one of the recommendations is to eat brown rice. But in Asia, where they've got 60% of the world's type 2 diabetes, brown rice does not fit their palates. Brown rice does have a grainier flavor. Brown rice is essentially non-milled rice. It still has the bran layer on it, the alurone and the germ, the embryo. Brown rice does have a grainy flavor to it, and they totally reject that as a solution in Asia. But they are willing to eat this high resistant starch rice in Asia as an alternative. I want to talk now about different forms of rice that are marketed. In Asia, they eat largely the medium grain, short grain rices that they're sticky. You can pick them up with your chopsticks. They are low amylose, which means they're high amylopectin. And it's only about 25% of the US rice consumption, but again, it's the predominant consumption in East Asia, I should say, China, Japan, and so forth along the coast, because by the time you get to South Asia, they eat, again, the long grain rices. This is a typical US rice. So 75% of the US consumption is long grain versus 25% consumption is medium grain in the US. It's a higher amylose. You can see that, and amylose contributes to the resistant starch. So this would have a higher resistant starch. This is about 1% resistant starch, whereas the low amylose lines is about 0.5 resistant starch. So one of the first things you can do is increase the percentage of amylose to increase the resistant starch. That's fine for the people who like the long grain, dry and fluffy rices, but that is not at all acceptable to the people who like the medium and short grain sticky rices. So in rice, what we call a high amylose rice, it gets up to 29% amylose. And I'm going to contrast this with maize. Maize can get up to 90% amylose, 10% amylopectin. So the high amylose maizes, the high amylose corns go really, really high in amylose, versus when we have a high amylose rice, it really gets only up to about 29%. So the definition of high is relative per crop that you're talking about. Again, we talked about some brown rice. One of the first things a nutritionist will recommend for a person who's newly diabetic is to switch to eating brown rice. And that's because it's got 7% more fiber. It's got more fats and proteins. It reduces the GI level and makes the food more acceptable and suitable for a diabetic to consume. And a lot of that is because the fiber and the proteins actually do interact with the digestive enzymes. And so that is the fiber and the proteins are contributing to that reduced digestion and the slower digestion of the starches that are in those grains also. If brown rice is so much healthier, why do we traditionally eat milled rice is one of the questions we hear a lot in rice. And it has to do with the fats, the lipids that are in the bran layer. If you have brown rice sitting on your counter, it's going to go rancid in a month or so. I keep mine in my freezer for that very reason, because the brown rice, the lipids in the brans go rancid very fast. And so traditionally, and we're talking from thousands of years ago, they began milling rice in order to increase the storage time, the storage ability of that rice by removing those lipids in the alurone layer. In 2008, we worked really hard to get rice a whole grain label. Before 2008, the whole grain label required a certain percent protein, and rice just does not naturally have that high level of protein. But in 2008, we were able to get FDA to change the definition of a whole grain to include brown rice, which is technically a whole grain. And so we can now put a whole grain and the advantages of whole grain onto the brown rice bags. And we've been pushing really hard for increased consumption of whole grains in the US. But in spite of that, from 2008 to 2022, US consumption of brown rice is still down there, very low at 3% of US consumption. So one way to make rice healthier for the world is to increase the ability to eat it as brown rice. I mean, those nutrients are there naturally in rice, but they're milled off traditionally. and are removed. Now, I'm going to point out here, I did add this real recently about the question about lectins. Yes, it's got a lot more protein in the brown rice, and included in that protein are some of the lectins. So it's a plus and minus to that point. A lot of the rice in the US is consumed as parboiled rice. So let's talk a little bit about what parboiled rice is and how does it increase the nutrition of rice itself. Again, this is a historic method of treating rice. They began, although these pictures are of historic methods of doing things, I have seen this method of parboiling rice that happening in Bangladesh just as recently as 20 years ago. So it is still some in the rural parts of India and mountainous areas of the Philippines. They still hand mill their rice in a mortar and pestle. And in many parts of Bangladesh, I personally saw parboiling happening in the backyards of the families, parboiling in this way. And they started doing this in some parts of the world. This is, again, a historic way of treating rice because it reduces the breakage of the rice when they mill it. And so they said, hey, it's worth the extra effort of doing this parboiling step because it improves the yield after we've hand milled it. And in the US, traditional parboiled rice is Uncle Ben's rice would be a typical, but now there are store brand parboiled rice is available also. But Uncle Ben's began parboiling rice in the 1940s in the US. So this has been happening a long time, not just overseas, but in the US too. Let's talk a little about how parboiling helps with the nutritional value and what parboiling is. So parboiling, you actually soak the rice in water. And what that does is it takes the water-soluble nutrients and makes them soluble and move to the inside. The water pushes the nutrients from the outside to the in. And then you steam the rice that has been wetted, and that pushes those minerals and nutrients further into the grain so that when you mill it, you do not lose those nutrients upon milling. Vitamins and minerals especially move in. This does not move proteins. Proteins are not as water soluble as the vitamins and minerals. So this does not really increase protein content, but it can increase vitamins and mineral content or reduce losses due to milling of that. In fact, this parboiling story is important to the discovery of thiamine that was discovered in 1926. Back in the 1850s, beriberi was a deadly neurological disease that became epidemic in the Dutch East Indies. And one of their military doctors, he was sent there to the Dutch East Indies to study it. He assumed it was a microbial disease. And so he took microbes out of bodies that had died from beriberi and began exposing them to chickens to see, hey, which microbe is going to cause this disease in chickens. Well, they found the disease in the chickens, but they found it in both the control group and those in which they had injected microbes. So it was in both the controls and the microbial treated chickens. He assumed it was because they was transferring this contagious disease from the injected chickens to the non-injected. So they did it again with a very strong separation between the injected chickens and the control chickens. But once again, they showed the leg paralysis that is associated with beriberi. And they, after about a month, but then mysteriously, both the microbial treated chickens and the controlled chickens recovered and stopped having the leg paralysis problems. So mysteriously, they recovered. He looked into that and he found out that the people who were taking care of the chickens had been feeding the chickens some leftover cooked white rice that was left over from the hospital. But about halfway through the second study, they had run out of that as a food source, and so they had switched to uncooked brown rice. He thinks, it's microbes that have been grown in our leftover cooked rice is what he's first suspected. So he began looking at the microbes in cooked rice. To cut to the end of the story, what they found out later is that no, it had nothing to do with microbes. It has to do with the retention of the nutrients in the parboiled rice. And that was discovered because a second doctor got put onto the study when Dr. Eichmann first retired. Dr. Geneticist got into the study, and he had been transferred over from the Dutch colonies in West Africa, where parboiled rice is the staple food. They've been parboiling rice for 1,000 years in West Africa. And so he came from West Africa, where there was also a consistent diet of rice, and he said, hey, and where they parboil the rice, they don't have berry. And so he began looking at the process of parboiling, and that led to the discovery of thiamine in 1926. So we know that when you parboil rice, it can increase the nutritional value. Let me tell you how to read this table. We've got white rice, parboiled rice, and brown rice. And it's based on eating a half cup of cooked rice. That's considered a single serving in the US, although that would be twice that, if not 4 times larger in some of the parts of the world where rice is a staple food. But in the US, we work with a half cup of cooked rice being a single serving. And this table shows that a single serving of rice in the US gives you approximately 100 calories, whether it's white, parboiled, or brown. And I've converted this then to percent daily value of how much of each of these vitamins and components that we want to eat in terms of a percent of the daily value of intake. So to convert these calories to percent daily value of a 2,000 calorie diet, that's 6%. What that means is, ideally, we would get all the minerals and nutrients up to also 6% of that daily vitamin intake or daily value intake. And if we do, then that eating that rice would be a more complete diet for the consumers. You can look at this table and quickly go, what's 6 or above and what's not 6 or above. So the ones that are not 6 or above are in red to make them easy for you to find, and those that are 6 or above are left in black. One of the first things we see is vitamin A is 0. No matter what we do to rice, we have 0 vitamin A, whether it's white rice, parboiled rice, or brown. Rice just does not have the ability to produce the beta carotene, which then the human body converts to the vitamin A. And this then has been a project for the Harvest Plus. It is genetically modified. It requires GMO, which is very difficult for us to get accepted by consumers around the world, not just in the US or Europe, but around the world. There's been a strong rejection of genetically modified rice. But what they found early on was, of the 3 enzymes that's required to create beta carotene, rice was lacking 2 of them. And so they did genetic modification and put in a gene from a daffodil and a gene from a bacteria. And now they have created rice that it actually is physically yellow to view it. And it creates the beta carotene to improve the diets of these people eating this rice. Again, though, it's been very difficult to get it accepted by consumers. It was approved for commercial production in the 2021, 20 years after the first creation of this rice. It was finally approved for commercial production in the Philippines. At this point in time, I'm aware of it being approved for production in only the Philippines. It is definitely, because of the GMO label that it has to have be on it, it's not finding acceptance around the world. However, and in this case, because they're lacking 2 entire genes, you cannot fix this with gene editing, a new method that's available to us. In the European Union, they now allow gene editing up to 20 DNA bases, but it would take more than those 20 to put these 2 necessary enzymes in. So it is being worked on. It is the solution that's been found with GMO, but it's being covered already by Harvest Plus. So obviously this group should not necessarily put their money into this effort because Harvest Plus is already handling it. So let's look at some of the other elements that are missing. Thiamine, we've talked about. Parboiling it increases thiamine to where it's now its proper percentage within the diet. So parboiling alone would fix the thiamine concern. But how would we fix it within white rice itself? White rice, as you can see, it's not 0. That means that there is some thiamine production in the endosperm already. That means we could probably boost it with tweaking the gene expression points of these genes with gene editing. So now this might be a gene editing solution to increase the expression of the genes necessary for thiamine production. Riboflavin and niacin, the same thing. It's not enough, but we could probably address this with gene editing because these genes do exist. We don't have to put a whole new enzyme in like we did for vitamin A. The enzymes already exist and are functioning in the endosperm. B6 the same, folate the same, but when we get to B12 and C again, we're lacking the enzymes. The endosperm just doesn't even produce those enzymes, and it would require then genetic modification. So a lot of the B vitamins we could probably address and improve in their content. As you can see, actually, parboiling alone fixes a lot of the concern. or consumption of brown rice can fix the concerns. The problem is this traditional milling of the rice that creates these multiple deficiencies. Let's look now at protein. Protein is insufficient in white rice and parboiled rice. Parboiling does not increase protein. So it's insufficient in white rice. Eating brown rice makes it a complete protein or sufficient protein. I shouldn't say complete protein because it is still low in lysine. So it doesn't have all the amino acid compounds that we would like, but it is a significantly higher protein product. We don't think of rice as a protein product in the US. As you can see, it's not that bad actually on its percentage of the daily recommended intake. It's not that bad in terms of protein. So where rice is a staple food, rice is a primary source of protein in their diets as well. And that's not known by a lot of people. There is a proprietary or licensed mutation that is known to increase protein by 1.5% within the endosperm. So we know that a single mutation can pop this protein content way up. Therefore, we could address it by creating another mutant. Because this particular gene is licensed, it's proprietary, it's private, it has royalties associated with it. But we could address this with additional mutation breeding and or traditional breeding for increased protein content. There is a limit to how high you can take protein in rice. It makes the rice unacceptable in terms of the mouthfeel as you eat the rice. If it's high protein, it takes on the wrong mouthfeel. So we can only get up to about 15% protein. Right now, milled rice has about 8% protein. So we can almost double it without ruining the mouthfeel. Fiber, very low in fiber. Parboiling increases the fiber a little bit, but only slightly. Versus brown rice would fix the fiber problem because of fibers that are in the bran itself. One way we talked about earlier, because amylose can increase the resistant starch, which is a fiber. If you can increase the amylose up to a high amylose, you can actually double the fiber in rice, but that just takes it from 1% to 2% of the recommended intake. That's not a big increase, but can be done with just simply high amylose. But there is a publicly available mutation that can be used. In fact, I have recently moved this SBE3 branching gene, a starch synthesis gene mutation that increases the resistant starch within the rice endosperm. We can get this up to 8%. So it increases it by 8 times. It gets us up from 1 to 8, essentially, for the recommended intake, because it increases the content by 8 times. So that would be a direction that could be taken with traditional breeding. Again, I've been working to transfer this gene into a rice germplasm that can be grown in the US. It's not high yielding at this time, but at least the gene, by putting it into a germplasm line that will plant and grow and flower within the US, it makes it more available to our US rice breeders to work with. Making the gene available and motivating the breeders to work with it are going to be two different challenges though. So I'm getting it in, and then the next challenge will be to get the breeders to work with it. Let's talk about some of the other minerals. Copper and manganese and selenium. Rice, even milled, has good content of those. Iron and zinc were talked about earlier. Harvest Plus is already working on those, so I'm going to skip over that also. I recently have identified some genomic regions that contain genes that increase magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. Usually when one goes up, all 3 goes up with my genes. So I have found 2 genes in particular, one on chromosome 2 and one on chromosome 7, that individually will increase the content of magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium about 3 to 4 times. That's not been published yet. We still need to study the bioavailability. Sometimes these compounds can be in the food, and I measure them when I totally digest the grains in a strong acid, but that doesn't mean that they would be available to the human digestive system. Just like we saw with the starch, sometimes there are resistant starches. Well, sometimes there are some compounds containing magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium that bind them and make them non-available through the human digestive system too. So those are the future studies that need to be done. Just because we found the genes that increase it in the grain itself, the next question is it increased in a manner that is available for human absorption when they eat it? That gets me to another question of phytic acid. Phytic acid is a compound that it binds to the protein and minerals, and it reduces the bioaccessibility of those proteins and minerals. So one of the things that we're thinking of doing in rice, and it has been looked at also in other crops, is to reduce the phytic acid. Just by reducing the phytic acid, then the food becomes more nutritious to consume. The protein that's there is more available to the consumer. The minerals that are there are more available to the consumer to absorb. For example, just consuming 5 to 10 milligrams of phytic acid can reduce iron absorption by 50%. So it doesn't take much phytic acid to reduce the availability of iron. And 10 to 25% of the brown rice phytic acid is retained after milling. So there is phytic acid in the endosperm, not just in the alurone layer. Phytic acid is especially concerning in diets that are already low in meat and animal products because it does bind or reduces the availability of those proteins that they're consuming. And it does a double damage in the animal feed industry because it not only reduces the nutritional value of the feed to the animals, but it causes an excess of phosphorus to become, because the phosphorus is not absorbed by the animals, it comes through in their waste. And that goes down into the water and causes algae blooms in Gulf of Mexico. So we have an environmental concern about having excess phytic acid in the feeds, the foods that our animals are eating. Now in the US, they've begun supplementing the animal feeds with phytase that breaks down the phytic acids. So that's how they've solved the problem to this date in the US. Because of that, a lot of the breeder interest in breeding for reduced phytic acid went poof away because they began instead in the US treating the animal feeds with phytase. So if we're going to try to address this issue for human consumption purposes, we have the genes already. There's a publicly available ARS created a mutation that reduces the phytic acid by 50%, and it freed up the phosphorus in the endosperm, made the phosphorus more available for the animals or humans to absorb. So we have already a publicly available mutation that could be used, but as I said, because they began treating animal feeds instead with phytase, the interest in breeding this trait went poof away, and so we would need to rejuvenate it with interest. Some of the low phytic acid mutations in other crops were reported to have very low germination capability, but this particular mutation created by ARS, so far we've not seen a problem with seedling vigor. It's not been notably depressed. It's not been studied to the nth degree, to be honest with you, but it's not been obviously depressed for germination and seedling vigor. So we feel that this would be a very useful, publicly available gene available to reduce phytic acid.
Shannon?
Yes.
We're running quite a bit over right now.
I'm sorry. Okay. Antioxidants, I'll just zip through it. Antioxidants are compounds that make things red or purple. We do have genes that can put that into rice also. Essentially, we can get rice almost as healthy as blueberries for antioxidants. And then my closing slide, again, it's the same topics. We've talked about how can we increase rice fiber, vitamins, minerals, protein, phytic acid reduction, and adding antioxidants.